What is snail bait? Snail bait? Yuck, I hate thinking about it, but it's a necessary evil in my world. Last summer, those slimy critters were all over my vegetable garden, munching away at my beautiful lettuce and tomato plants. I tried all kinds of natural remedies, crushed eggshells, coffee grounds, but nothing seemed to work. In the end, I had to break down and buy the snail bait. I still felt a pang of guilt using it, knowing it can be harmful to other animals, but I also take pride in growing my own food, and I wasn't about to let those snails have it all their own way. What does snail bait look like? Snail bait usually looks like small pellets, sometimes blue or green in color. Honestly, it reminds me of the dried kibble I used to feed my dog years ago. That's the tricky thing. The pellets are small and can be scattered easily, and since they're often flavored to attract the snails, they might also be tempting to pets. I remember being extra careful to sprinkle only around the base of my plants, and to always keep the container stored well out of reach of curious noses. How much snail bait will kill a dog? I don't even want to think about an amount. Those online resources say a teaspoon per 10 pounds of body weight can be dangerous, but that's terrifying. Even a tiny bit seems like it could be too much. My dog, Bailey, is a bouncy Labrador who loves sniffing around the garden. There's no way I'd risk him getting sick by having snail bait around. It's just not worth it. I'd rather spend extra time hand-picking snails, or find a safer, pet-friendly solution than risk Bailey's health. Is Corey's snail bait safe for dogs? While Corey's snail bait is advertised as being safer around pets, I wouldn't take any chances. It seems the active ingredient in their bait is iron phosphate, which is less toxic than some alternatives. But even less toxic doesn't mean safe. Plus, a big factor is the size of the dog. A few pellets might upset a small dog's stomach, but that same amount would be less risky for a large breed. I honestly find the whole thing stressful. I don't like the idea of my dog being attracted to those pellets and potentially getting sick, so I tend to err on the side of extreme caution. Does snail bait kill cats? Absolutely. Snail bait is dangerous for cats, just like it is for dogs. Maybe even more so. Those sneaky felines are natural hunters, and there's no guarantee they wouldn't see a brightly colored bait pellet as a tasty treat. I remember reading a scary story online about a neighbor's cat who got a hold of some snail bait and ended up really sick. It was awful. Since then, I wouldn't dream of using snail bait in my yard if there's any chance a stray cat might wander through. It's just not worth the risk of harming an innocent animal. Does snail bait kill rats? No, snail bait won't do a thing against those pesky rats. Trust me, I've had my fair share of battles with both garden snails and furry scavengers. Snail bait is designed specifically to target snails and slugs. It often contains ingredients like metaldehyde or iron phosphate, which mess with their digestive systems. Those chemicals wouldn't affect rats in the same way. In fact, I've seen those bold creatures munching on snail bait pellets before, seemingly unharmed. If you got a rat problem, you'll need to switch tactics and set traps or use bait designed specifically for rodents. How does snail bait work? The science behind snail bait is both interesting and a little gross. You see, most snail baits contain a chemical called metaldehyde, which messes with the snail's ability to produce moisture. It basically triggers them to produce a ton of mucus, dehydrating them rapidly and leading to their death. Honestly, it sounds like a pretty unpleasant way to go. And here's where it gets tricky. The bait also includes attractants like yummy smells that entice the snails to eat it in the first place. That's the whole point, but also what makes it dangerous to other animals. Is snail bait toxic to humans? Unfortunately, yes, snail bait is most definitely toxic to humans too. I remember when my kids were little, and they were always putting everything in their mouths. The thought of them finding the snail bait in the garden shed terrified me. It usually contains substances like metaldehyde, which are really harmful for people too, even just small amounts. Nowadays, I always make sure to read the label of any gardening products carefully, keeping them locked away and well out of reach of tiny hands. Does snail bait kill birds? Snail bait can definitely be dangerous for birds, especially depending on the type of bait. Some older formulas use metaldehyde, which is highly toxic to birds if ingested. Luckily, there are newer versions with iron phosphate that are less harmful to birds. But even with the safer options, I still worry. Birds are so curious and might peck at anything brightly colored. Plus, some birds eat snails, and if they eat a poison snail, it could still make them sick. If I can avoid using snail bait altogether, that's always my preference. There are other ways to deal with those slimy pests, even if it takes a little more effort. Does snail bait kill worms? Snail bait can be a double-edged sword for worms in my garden. Here's the thing. Most snail baits target the digestive system of snails and slugs. The active ingredient, often iron phosphate, disrupts their ability to process food. Unfortunately, some worms can ingest the bait too, and it might have similar effects on them. I've seen studies online that suggest some worms might be more susceptible than others. The good news is that some bait products are formulated to be less attractive to worms. They might be larger pellets or contain ingredients that worms don't find as appealing. When I have a bad snail problem, I try to find these specific worm-safe baits. It's not a perfect solution, but it at least helps minimize the risk of harming the beneficial worms in my soil. Those little guys are great for aeration and keeping my garden healthy, so I definitely don't want to wipe them out in the battle against the snails.